Welcome to Design Domination, where you'll learn to become a better designer so you can dominate your competition. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Colleen Grotzer, and in this episode of Design Domination, I'm going to talk about perfecting your print process so you can avoid costly errors and save face. I'm going to cover file setup, folds, binding, paper, ink, fonts, images, and how to get print bids. Understanding the technical setup of files, plus how paper and ink interact with one another, is crucial. One, because print is finite. You cannot just make changes later like you can with a website or digital file. There is no undo. There's only a costly redo. And two, because some print prep mistakes can result in charges for new proofs or a delay in the job getting completed. That could cost you financially and non-monetarily, meaning embarrassment. Let's start by talking about file setup, which is affected by several factors, as I'll explain. First, you want to create a separate file for each differently sized print piece. For example, a business card in one file, a flyer in another, as opposed to combining them all in one file. Your document dimensions should typically be the trim or final size of the piece. Next, you need to decide whether you're going to use single pages or facing pages. Typically, single pages are for pieces that are not bound, such as postcards, posters, or flyers. Facing pages, on the other hand, are what you need when you have spreads for like a brochure or a book or a magazine. Next, you need to set the measurement for the bleeds. Typically, bleeds are 1/8 of an inch, but some printers require more and some might require less. If you're using InDesign and you've already created your document, then you would go to File and then Document Setup and enter 0.125 inches for the bleed. If you're just creating your new document, then you'll just enter that measurement in the bleed settings. When you're working in your document, you want to make sure that any design elements, background colors, or other images that appear close to the trim get extended out to that bleed mark outside of the final document size. If you don't do that, then any misalignment that occurs with the paper during the printing process is going to result in white edges and look sloppy. Printing is not exact, and the shifting of paper can happen. Now that we've talked about bleeds, let's talk about the safety area, which is also called the live area. You want to keep text and other important elements, such as photos, within the safety area, ensuring that they won't be too close to the trim and risk being trimmed off. The safety area is space that's further within the document size. So the bleeds extend beyond the size of the document, and then you have your document size, and within that you have a margin of space, which can vary. That is the safety area. Another measurement that you set in the document setup is the gutter. Not to be confused with the gutter between columns or the one on your roof. The gutter is the space between the facing pages of a publication, the two inside margins. If a publication is perfect bound or saddle stitched, such as a magazine or book, you need sufficient gutter. The more pages the publication has, the larger the gutter needs to be. Mess this up by not having enough gutter, and the reader will end up having to hold open the book with all their might just to read the text that ends up in that area. If you send it to the printer and they see that it's an issue, guess what? Now you've got to increase the gutter, resulting in reflowed text and additional pages. And then you have to tell the client that the page count will change, which means the print cost will increase as a result. Spiral-bound publications, which I'll talk about later, lay flat, so they don't need a gutter. And if you have any crossovers, meaning elements that go into the gutter and across the spread, such as lines or photos or even background colors, then you have to account for the width of the gutter by adjusting the elements so that when the book is actually printed and bound, that they line up properly. And you can get some guidance from the printer about that as well. Your document setup is also going to be affected by the types of fold or binding. I'll get into a few of these in this episode. There are so many types of folds: accordions, gates, maps, parallels, posters, and rolls. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my! You must properly set up your files for the particular type of fold. Otherwise, text can get trimmed off because you didn't create what's called a short panel, and elements will be misaligned on the page, or the piece won't fold properly. The thicker the paper, the shorter the fold-in panels need to be, and the fold-in panels are your short panels. Trish Witkowski did a ton of research on more than 180 folds that led her to write a 2-volume book, 850 pages, people, to address folds and how to properly set up your files. It's called The Professional's Guide to Folding. Trish won an award for this book, and I highly recommend it for its comprehensiveness because it includes a glossary of terms, it has diagrams of the file setup with dimensions, it has folds marked, and it shows the order that each fold occurs if there's more than one fold. It also shows the level of complexity for each type of fold, which is useful to predetermine how costly it might be for the printer to do that fold compared to some other folds. And it also includes special things to consider when using a specific type of fold. Okay, let's go over a few common types of binding. The first is saddle stitching. Saddle stitching sounds like it has something to do with horses, but it actually kind of does. Collated folded sheets are draped over a saddle-like apparatus during the stapling process, where the staples are inserted in the fold from the outside and between the centermost pages. 2 or 3 staples are typically used. Now, if you make the mistake of asking the printer for stapling and not saddle stitching, then the printer is going to think that you mean a single staple in the upper left corner or somewhere else. Saddle stitching works for publications up to about 100 pages or so, maybe less, depending on the thickness of the paper. Note that the number of pages must be in a multiple of 4, as in there are 4 pages to a folded sheet. You may or may not have to add blank pages at the end of your document in order to achieve that multiple of 4. Another common type of binding is perfect binding. Perfect binding is when a publication is bound by glue inside the spine, and the spine is flat so it can be designed and printed. Hard or soft cover books are an example of this, but you often see thin magazines with perfect binding as well. And typically, the cover stock is heavier than the text pages. If you have a book with hundreds of pages or even 1,000 pages, you definitely need cover stock that makes the book sturdy enough. Usually the minimum number of pages that you can consider for perfect binding is 48, depending on the paper stock. Unlike saddle-stitched books, perfect bound books only need pages in a multiple of 2. Spiral or wire binding involves only the cutting of pages, no folding. Think of it as a bunch of single sheets stacked and bound together. You only need to have pages in multiples of 2 as opposed to 4 with the other types of binding that involve folding. But as a result, you need to consider bleeds on all 4 sides of the pages if you have bleeds. It can be tricky to set up a spiral-bound book, so typically what I do is create them as single pages and then add the bleeds where needed, and then I export to a PDF with spreads just so I can see it that way if I want to. But there's a free InDesign script that allows you to set up a spiral-bound document as spreads, and then it separates them so they still appear as spreads, but they allow for the bleed all the way around the page. The advantage to this type of binding is that it allows books to lay flat when open or folded, and therefore you don't have an actual gutter. But you do have to account for holes to be drilled inside the trim on the binding side of the publication. You don't want to end up with any text, design elements, or ads in that area because that won't look very good. So if you have a 5.5 by 8.5 inch document and you want 1/2 inch margins all the way around, your inside margins should be a little larger than a 1/2 inch to accommodate for the space of the drilled holes. Let's talk about covers versus text pages. If you're going to have different paper stock for the cover and text pages, which is called a plus cover, or if there will be a spine, you need to set up the covers in a separate file from the text pages. When setting up a perfect bound or case bound cover, create a file with one page for the back cover plus spine next to it, plus the front cover next to that, in that order, how it would look if laying flat. And then a second page for the left inside cover, plus the spine, plus the right inside cover. Here's a side note about covers. The front cover is referred to as cover 1. The inside of the front cover is cover 2. The inside of the back cover is cover 3. And the back cover is cover 4. Once the layout has been finalized, you need to tell the printer the number of text pages it has so they can tell you the width that the spine needs to be, which is also affected by the paper thickness. So you'll have to go back into your cover files and adjust the width of the spine based on the answer that they give you. By the way, if the cover and text pages print on the same paper stock, that's referred to as self-cover, the opposite of plus cover. Okay, let's talk about fonts. Here's some guidelines about fonts. Choose OpenType fonts whenever possible. They are cross-platform, meaning Mac and PC compatible, and they include a larger set of characters such as fractions. So the benefit of that is that you don't have to go find another font that looks similar to the one you're using if it doesn't have a certain character. It should include everything that you would need. You want to choose fonts that are legally allowed to be embedded into a PDF so that when you output to a PDF for a proof or for the printer, you can include those fonts, which is a must. Nothing like selecting a typeface and then going to save the files for printing and getting a warning that you can't. And if you're sending native files to the printer, you definitely want to include fonts and all linked images. Even though two fonts have the same name, it doesn't mean that they are the same version. And assuming so can result in reflowed text when the printer processes the file. You also want to search for and remove extraneous fonts from your layout document. In an InDesign, you do this via the Type menu and then Find Font. If you've imported from a Word document, then it's very likely to have brought in a slew of unwanted fonts. So searching for them will ensure that you didn't miss any that you meant to replace. Okay, let's move on to images. With images, you want to stick with print formats such as PSD, TIFF, JPEG, EPS, or PDF, and avoid formats for the web such as PNG and GIF. The printing process is based in CMYK as opposed to RGB for the web. However, usually it's better to leave your images in RGB mode than in CMYK and allow that conversion to be done in the final part of the process. I'm going to provide links in the show notes to a thorough article about this by InDesign Secrets so that you can get all the information about that. You also want to make sure that you're using images with sufficient resolution, typically 300 ppi at the actual size that it will be used. When working with images, if you have modified any of them, you want to be sure to clean up your work. One trick I use is in Photoshop, I'll add a stroke to masks and then I will zoom in to see areas that I might have missed because it will highlight all of them for me to make it easier to see. Of course, it also helps to have a clean monitor. There's nothing like a smudge on your monitor to make you try unsuccessfully and repeatedly to mask it out of a Photoshop document. I also recommend zooming in on your images and on your proofs and print proofs and check that points on any shapes that you've created, that they connect where they should, and where you have any blocks of color or images against any blocks of color, that those are all lined up and there's nothing overlapping where it shouldn't be. You also want to ensure that all linked images are up to date. In InDesign, you would look at the links panel. Okay, let's talk about ink and color. Generally, you want no more than 300% of a CMYK build in any particular spot. That could mean, for example, 100% cyan, 100% magenta, and 100% yellow. In InDesign, you would go to Window and then Output and then Separations Preview to view the color separations and set the ink limit. By default, it's set to 300%. If a printer asks you to change this number, this is where you would change it. The reason for possibly changing it could be if you're printing on very thin paper, such as newsprint, where the ink soaks in quite a bit to the paper. When you're looking at this ink limit in InDesign, it will show you in red the areas that need adjusting. You want to adjust color builds based on the type of paper stock that's going to be used. This is especially important if you're printing on uncoated paper where ink soaks in more and therefore appears darker. For example, there are some yellow color mixes and some yellow Pantone colors that appear yellow on coated paper, but then on uncoated paper, they print with an orange tint to them. So you want to make the adjustment so that doesn't happen. So I recommend referring to Pantone books for the CMYK builds and the Pantone colors on uncoated and coated paper to ensure that they are going to be consistent. If you're using metallic or day glow inks, those work best on coated paper stock as opposed to uncoated, although you do get an interesting effect when you print metallic inks on uncoated paper. Now, if you're printing on colored paper, you need to account for the color build of the ink and of the paper. You can find out the equivalent CMYK values for the paper from the printer or the paper company, and then you can subtract those values from your ink colors. For example, if the paper is magenta 10 and yellow 20, and you want the ink to be cyan 20, magenta 40, and yellow 20, you should spec the color as cyan 20, which is the same, and then magenta 30, which is the difference between the ink color of 40 and the paper color of 10, and then yellow 0, because the ink color is yellow 20 and the paper color is yellow 20 as well, so you don't need to add anything. You can ask the printer for what's called a drawdown to see how the ink will actually appear on that paper before it gets printed. You want to ensure that you're not outputting too many colors from your document. Having Pantone 123C and 123U is like two different colors in the file. They will appear separately in the separations preview panel, meaning they be output separately too. So if you had a two-color job using 123 and black, you'd end up with 3 plates instead of 2 in that particular case. Keep in mind that spot colors output as separate colors from CMYK because they're not mixes. You also want to make sure that you're using the correct color profile for printing. Typically, you want to use the US web-coded SWOP version 2 profile unless the printer says otherwise. When it comes to outputting your final PDF, you can use the press settings that are included in InDesign, or you can also ask your printer for a profile that you can import into InDesign. This will ensure that you have the proper settings, especially for their equipment. If the printer doesn't specify their own preset, you should use one of the 3 PDF/X options. So PDF X-1A, PDF X-3, or PDF X-4. Now let's talk about coatings. And by that, I mean any type of coating or varnish that might be needed for the printed piece. They're also the reason I like to sniff my print samples when I get them from the printer. It's a really good idea to find out from your client the lifespan of the printed piece and let the printer know that, as well as the amount of ink coverage, so they can advise you if a coating is needed. Coatings can increase the longevity of a piece, adding durability, or they can prevent fingerprinting or ink smudges. Aqueous coating is a clear, fast-drying, water-based coating that is typically applied to an entire printed piece or to at least one side of a sheet. It allows for someone to write on it without smudging, unlike other coatings. Varnish is basically clear ink and can be gloss, satin, or matte finish. And it can be used as a flood or spot. A flood varnish covers the entire printed page for protection or just for shine. And a spot varnish adds shine to specific areas of a page that you designate. UV coatings are cured by exposure to ultraviolet light to quickly dry and harden the coating. They provide high gloss, but they might crack when scored or folded due to thickness and hardness of the coating. Okay, let's talk about print specs. If you work somewhere that has someone like a production manager that handles getting print bids, that's great. But if not, or if you're doing work for a client, it's best for you to get print bids because most clients don't understand the printing terms. Here's some other reasons why it's very important for you to get the bids. Once upon a time, I had a client who decided to get their own print bids, and unbeknownst to me, they had asked the printer to use two completely separate colors from their brand colors, which were purple and turquoise. And I had already sent the client a proof, so she saw the colors and she knew what these Pantone colors were. So I sent the job to the printer. The printer said, well, this isn't in Reflex blue and black. And I was like, well, of course it's not. Their brand colors are teal and purple. Why would it be in Reflex blue and black? So the printer said, well, this is what the client asked that it be spec'd with because it was cheaper. That's when I found out that she wanted to save a few bucks by using these two colors that had absolutely nothing to do with their brand. I mean, my mind was blown. I couldn't understand this at all. I mean, it was maybe a few bucks. I mean, it was a little, but certainly not worth the brand inconsistency as a result. After some other frustrating situations, that fairy tale ended with the client being fired. Another time that a client got print bids was for an annual report I had designed. I had sent them a proof. They saw it was 24 pages. I sent it to the printer of their choice. And that printer called to say this didn't match the specs that they had given the estimate on. And I'm like, well, what's different? And they said, well, they only provided an estimate for 4 pages. I was, again, totally confused. So I called my client and she said she knew the job was 24 pages, not 4 pages. So I called the printer back and I asked her who she talked to. And then she mentioned an entirely different person who I had no idea was even involved. So this third person had gotten the print bids, but she did them wrong. It cost me at least 2 hours of my time and a year off my life to get this all straightened out. And then the job had to be rebid to all of the printers again because the client had picked this particular one based on them having the lowest price. But since the job was actually 24 pages and not 4, when the job got rebid, a different printer came in at the lowest. So I then called and explained to the first printer what had happened and that the job was now going to another printer. Ensure your job matches the specs from the print bids before you send it to the printer. Otherwise, the print bids need to be updated for accurate pricing. If the job is supposed to print in 4-color process, then ensure that only process colors are being used in the file. If the job was 24 pages when it was bid out and it's now 36, you need to get a revised estimate. Think of it as a dish on a restaurant menu. You're the chef preparing the meal with your recipe, and the printer is at the table ordering their meal. They expect to get what they ordered. If they expect chicken and get beef instead, they will send it back, as they will do with your file. To get print bids, you need the following information: the size, consisting of flat size, which is the size of it before any folding, and then the finished size, which is the final size of the printed piece. So if the result is a 5.5 by 8.5 inch booklet, the flat size would be 11 by 8.5, and the finished size would be 5.5 by 8.5. Next, you need to provide the number of pages. So if you have 24 text pages and a separate cover, then that's 24 pages plus cover. If it's 24 pages and the cover is printing on the same stock as the text, then it would be 24 pages self-cover. The third item you need to provide is the paper stock for the piece. Now, you don't have to use cover stocks for covers and text weights only for text, but you need to specify what paper weight you want for everything. So if it's a book, you need to specify what paper you want to use for the cover and for the text pages. Ask a printer if they will provide you with some paper books so that you can get an idea for different text and cover weights, as well as for uncoated and coated paper stocks. For coated paper, specify if it should be dull or matte, semi-gloss or gloss. For uncoated paper stock, specify if it should be smooth, laid, or linen, for example. Specify the color of the paper if it's not white. You may also specify the paper brightness, which is measured on a scale of 0 to 100. The higher the number, the brighter the paper. So if you want a really bright paper, then you would ask for something in the 90s to 100. Then you want to state whether there are any bleeds, partial bleeds, or full bleeds. And then number of colors, if it's 2 spot colors, if it's 4 color process, or maybe it's 4 color process plus a metallic ink. Then you need to specify the type of binding if there's any. So that would be perfect bound, saddle stitched, spiral, or something different. If there needs to be a coating or varnish, you need to state that. And you need to state if it's going to be a flood or spot varnish. And then you want to provide the quantity. Finally, specify who should get proofs and if they should be hard proofs, meaning paper proofs, or if PDF proofs are okay. And don't forget to request that you get a few samples of the final product for your portfolio. Prior to sending the files to the printer, you want to get in writing from the client an approval to print. It doesn't have to be something they sign, although that might deter them from making changes after the files are at the printer because it can be a pain in the rear for them to sign a form again. But it could just be acknowledgement via email. And not just an okay, but okay to print or approved for printing is what you need. It just needs to be clear. If you're working on a project where there's more than one piece and you have some pieces that might have to fit into another, like cards into an envelope, and I feel like this is just so obvious it shouldn't need to be stated, but I've made this mistake a couple of times. Make sure that the piece that has to fit into another one isn't larger than the one it needs to fit into. So, for example, I create lots of direct mail and invitation packages. And one time the client and I both missed the fact that the reply card was too large to go into the enclosing envelope. Thankfully, the printer caught it and I was able to adjust the size of it. But could you imagine if it had been printed that way? So one thing you can do is to make paper dummies in cases where you have projects with several pieces to see how they fit together and fit into the others. Make sure that you and the client review proofs. They don't look for the same things that you'll be looking for. Plus, whoever foots the bill should be the one to provide the final approval. That puts the liability on them. Here's a true story. A colleague once had to reprint a brochure at his expense, which was about $2,000, because he didn't show the client the proof and something got past him. After a file has been sent to the printer, tell the client to contact you, not the printer, if they have any edits at that stage. 1, because you're more familiar with your file than the printer is, and 2, it ensures that you have up-to-date files in case the client ever decides to reprint or make updates in the future. Remember that it's important to maintain communication with the printer before and throughout the entire process to get the best results. Use your printer as a resource. I made a few minor screw-ups when I first sent files to the printer at my first job out of college. Luckily, the printers that the organization used were very helpful and always told me what the issues were and how to fix them. The best part was that no one at my workplace had to know. Don't be afraid to ask them questions about your file setup before you start and before providing the print file. If you have a good ongoing relationship with some printers, then you can also discuss some ideas before presenting them to the client, so the printer can help you find a format or a die cut or special finishing that fits into the client's budget. They can also advise you about any coatings or if a piece should be scored, meaning they add a vertical crease on the front and back covers near the spine to facilitate folding, so that repeated opening of the publication doesn't wear on the spine. Thin and thick publications can have this, by the way. Printers can also provide folding dummies upon request to you and the client so that everyone understands how something will fold and lay out after it's been printed. I recommend asking a local printer for a tour of their facility so that you can better understand the print process and how their equipment works. Don't forget to check out the links in the show notes at creative-boost.com/podcast. If you found this information helpful, please share, subscribe, or leave a review. And thanks for listening.